Alright, welcome to our fourth video on carbon chemistry. This is where we look at chemistry of living things. This is the biochemistry section of carbon chemistry. So we're going to be taking a look back at a few things you've seen before, and then going forward into pure biochemistry. So you should have a handout that I gave you on Monday. You're going to want to fill in the blanks on your notes with the yellow words from the PowerPoint. So making things a little bit easier for you here, because we're doing two videos on one day, and this actual PowerPoint and handout comes from Kim Cornett. Miss Cornett is from Talent Academy, so we do want to thank her for providing us with some materials, making things a lot easier, because it's not easy to make all these videos for you guys. So if we can cut corners somewhere, like in setting up the PowerPoints, we are greatly appreciative, and thank you to Miss Cornett and Talent Academy for this. Alright, so a bit of review. What makes something an organic compound or molecule? It must have carbon. If it doesn't have carbon atoms in it, it's not an organic molecule. We saw this a little bit in the second video. I brought up alcohol, OH, as a functional group. The R that we saw in that, I was saying, could be any carbon chain. If the R was hydrogen, you'd actually have water, and that's not a more organic molecule. So you want that R to always start with carbon. Otherwise, it is not organic compounds that you're looking at. You have to have carbon. So, once again, carbon is such a big deal because it binds with itself and other elements in a variety of ways. The 4 valence electrons means 4 bonds. And we can see that we can have straight chains, branch chains, and rings. We've brought this up a few times over this series. This is the big deal. And you're going to see this really in play today, because you're looking at the chemistry of life a little bit. And back to CHNOPS, the 6 most abundant elements in living organisms. Now, I talked about CHNOPS earlier in the video series, and I talked about it in terms of what would bond to carbon, and then there was the halogens. And the halogens aren't abundant in living organisms. That's why we don't talk about it in CHNOPS. Even though halogens are prevalent within organic chemistry as substitution type stuff, and you saw it in sucralose, different things like that. Ultimately, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur are your most abundant elements in living organisms. And we have CHNOPS as a way to remember that, or ponchos. Just got to remember on ponchos, that second O is just oxygen again for some reason. Because oxygen has a lot of functional groups, right? There's esters, there's ethers, there's carboxylic acids, there's alcohols, there's all kinds of places that oxygen shows up. So maybe that's why it's twice. Realistically, it's in there so that ponchos sounds right, like chomps, CHNOPS, however you want to say it. Hard to say. So ponchos, a lot easier to say. I just got to remember that second O is still oxygen. Now this is a nice little breakdown for you. The elements of life. We have 96% of our body coming from carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Okay? And if you look, the most abundant element, 65%, is oxygen. Maybe that's why it's doubled up in ponchos. Yeah? Maybe there's a cool little thing there you can remember with ponchos. It's that oxygen is the most. That's why it's in there twice. Honestly, it's there so that it sounds correct. But maybe this is a thing you could also remember within ponchos, is that oxygen is the most abundant element in your body. And you also have carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Everything else is 3.7%. So that's kind of crazy. And another thing that's kind of crazy is that the elements that you need to live are the same as the elements that your cat or your dog or a bird or a tree needs to live. All living things use the same elements. That's kind of awesome when you think about it. That's really, really neat and a big idea. So there's some importance there. Now, within a living organism, there are other elements as well, and other molecules, polyatomic ions, stuff like that. The two most common small ones are water and salt. So water, of course, H2O, salt, sodium chloride. There's a sodium-potassium pump in cells. There's lots of these small molecules in living organisms that provide a lot of different things for us. Okay, cells and different organelles within the cells use these small non-organic molecules for a variety of things. Now, if we go into the large molecules, remember these are what we were talking about yesterday, in our last video, which is the polymers. They're made up of monomers, which are small molecules that are going to repeat. And sometimes you might have a set of different monomers. One type of thing that does that is DNA. DNA and RNA as well are made up of what are called nucleic acids, and these nucleic acids end up forming a sequence. It's a giant polymer made out of a small set of monomers, and the sequence of those monomers creates different genes within our body that can be expressed to make different things. Okay, so DNA gives us our genetic information, gives inherited traits that you get from your parents. Every person's DNA is unique. That's why you often see it coming up in crime shows. A lot of the Law and Orders will talk about DNA evidence, stuff like that. Well, this is really what they're getting at, is that you have essentially a fingerprint of genetic information made out of a giant polymer of nucleic acids. These nucleic acid polymers are then the basis for doing a lot within your body. So the DNA will code to an RNA, which is kind of like a read. So essentially DNA is kind of read-only. You go through and you read it, and you create this RNA, which is more of like a working copy of the DNA itself, so the DNA doesn't get hurt. And the RNA will code what's called a protein. Okay? So a protein is your next common large molecule inside the living organisms. You saw this picture earlier. It's pretty crazy and hard to draw that. But there's a reason for it. That weird twirly thing you're seeing, how it's like overlapping itself. There's different levels of structure to a protein. What you're seeing here is that you have the basic backbone, which is a amino acid chain. So there's all these different amino acids, and we're linking all these amino acids together. Here we have pictured serine, one of my favorite ones. It's one of the few places where we see sulfur in an organic molecule. So not very common to see sulfur. So amino acids like serine here are going to be combined to create a chain, but then that chain is going to interact with itself, and it's going to have what's called protein folding, which is what's illustrated in that picture. That's why things are like doing all these curly cues, and they're wrapped around each other, and it's all kind of different. And protein tends to be in places like meats, fish, dairy. It's essential for our bones. It's essential for hair, nails, lots of different things. Cartilage, skin, your muscles. You should definitely write down that list. It's very important to know where protein comes from and what it does to help. Essentially, proteins, there's a special class of proteins we talked about previously. That's called an enzyme. enzymes catalyze reactions. Proteins are kind of like the doers within the cell. They end up enacting a lot of the actions that are recorded within the DNA. So the DNA creates an RNA, which helps create this protein. And the body's like reading the RNA going, oh, this is how I make a protein. Cool. And it makes that protein, and then the protein goes and does something. Maybe it catalyzes a reaction. All kinds of different things that this guy can do. So our next big molecule is lipids, more commonly known as fats. Lipids, as you can see here, this is I think that's a triglyceride, shown in that picture there. Fats are really good ways to store energy. So gram for gram, the lipids store more energy than carbohydrates, which are your more common way of getting energy into your body. Those are like glucose and fructose, stuff like that. We'll talk about those next. But lipids, they're found in animal fat, oils, waxes, cell membranes, lots and lots of places that they are found, and they're essentially a way to store energy for later use. Okay. Finally, on the large molecule list, we have carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are found in breads, they're found in pasta, potatoes, rice, sugar. Carbohydrates are made out of hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. This is a simple carbohydrate that they're showing you here. So we have glucose. You could create a complex carbohydrate by linking together multiple sugars. So for instance, lactose, I'm lactose intolerant myself, means I lack the enzyme that converts a complex carbohydrate made out of more than one sugar into a single sugar so that your body can then break it down and use it as energy or store it for later as fat. So because I lack lactose, if I drink milk, lots of pain could happen because my body doesn't know how to process it and just kind of sits there. So there's actually pills for that. Lactate is a lactase enzyme. So you can actually get a protein that actually give these pills that are proteins that then break down that complex carbohydrate for you. So your four most common large molecules, once again, DNA, proteins, lipids or fats, and carbohydrates or sugars. That's what's going on in living organisms. And again, what you're seeing with these large molecules and living things, you see carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Chinops, or ponchos if you prefer. So lots of different molecules inside the body, lots of different things playing parts in the cycle of life.